Hello, everyone. I I hope you can hear me. My name is Henry Lohendorf, and I'm the co-chair of the Greater New Haven Peace Council. The Peace Council is bringing you this webinar tonight on Afghanistan. Question of why is Afghanistan, why its neighbors and refugees are a constant battlefield. Our speaker tonight is Bahman Azad. Dr. Azad is the Executive Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council, and he is a retired professor of sociology and economics in New Jersey. His full bio, there's a larger bio that was on the flyer that we had on the screen. And I can put that up again if anyone wants it, but I don't want to take a lot of time on that. We're going to start in just a few minutes. Just some housekeeping. Please enter your questions in the Q&A icon. Hit the Q&A icon that is at the bottom of your screen. If you've come in with a computer, Q&A, put in questions there. And thank you in the chat for letting me know that you can hear me. I can hear myself, but it's not a good sign if nobody else can hear me. Thank you. We'll take questions. Now, Bahman is going to talk for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions and we'll continue. And he's going to keep his presentation relatively short so that the listeners can direct this webinar and answer the questions that they have. And that's what we're hoping you will do. So I don't see Bahman on. He stepped out for a moment. Here he is. I think Bahman, we could get started. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else I need to add at this point. I have some other points I'll make later, but I think that the best thing to do is get started with this webinar and let you begin.
Thank you, Henry, and thanks to Greater New Haven Peace Council for inviting me. It's an honor to be among our friends. You know, the issue of Afghanistan has been for a while on the front page of the media, and suddenly again it has disappeared. They're jumping to other issues. The period that it was on was primarily focused on the messy withdrawal of the U.S., but not really on what was the reason for U.S. being there. Why did they go in? Why did they get out? And what was the whole objective? What was achieved? So I'm going to address some of these issues briefly, give you a background also to the history of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, and then touch upon some of the issues that relate to the present situation after the withdrawal and departure. I wouldn't call it withdrawal. For now, I use that the term departure from Afghanistan. You know, President Biden, after the heavy criticism that the government received because of its inadequate handling of the departure and withdrawal, U.S. Military, U.S. diplomatic personnel, reporters, and the collaborators with the U.S. military, Afghan collaborators, and the panic that it created. The whole focus has been on criticizing that process. And President Biden was forced to do a press conference after a few days and explain why this thing happened the way it happened. There were several things in his speech that were important. I'm not going to address all of them because of the shortness of time. Of course, he talked about we didn't expect this to unravel so quickly, which is not true. One cannot believe it after 20 years of being in control of every aspect of Afghan country, Afghanistan, telling us that they didn't know what was coming. He also mentioned that the Afghan military collapsed without, before what we expected. His argument was that we gave them everything. We even paid their salaries and gave them weapons and even gave them air power and everything else, but we couldn't give them the will. Which was obvious because any military, its main mission, its main task is to defend the country against foreign invaders and enemies. A military that is being forced to serve the foreign invaders and shoot at its own people definitely will collapse. And I don't think any military put in that situation would survive. But this is besides the point. It was just a distraction, I think. It's just blaming the victim themselves rather than accepting responsibility for everything that happened. But I want to focus on another aspect of his talk, one small part that can be the segue to my talk and also revealing in some ways. He said, we went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with a clear goal: get those who attacked US on September 11, 2001. And then he follows, our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Well, it's an interesting words to come out of the mouth of the US president, because half of it, the first half of it, is absolute lie, that we went in there to fight terrorism, and that we've been only there 20 years. And secondly, it's a really important confession to a truth that despite the claims that they were there to build democracy and support Afghan women and all that, they didn't mean that. That was not the cause or their objective. And he's true about that, correct. Because they actually went in there and destroyed the democracy to carry out their own plans. There was a democratic government in place in Afghanistan before the US invaded. So that is absolute truth. So we're dealing with two truths here, or two facts here. One, it was never meant to be, or three of them, never meant to be a fight against terrorism. Second, it was never meant to build a democracy. And third, it was not 20 years. It was almost 60 years, or maybe more. And I want to go back to that history of it just quickly to show you what the purpose is. My argument is that US went to Afghanistan, or got involved with Afghanistan 60 years ago, 70 years ago, as a result of Cold War with the Soviet Union after World War II. And now departed because it considered the Cold War with China as a more important element than a local war. So, and I want to give you a background to it so that it becomes clear that the whole thing is a distraction from the real objectives of the United States as they are presenting it. It was not 20 years ago, in fact, and it was not against terrorism. After World War II, as early as 1949, the Western press, especially the British press, fearful of the prestige of the Soviet Union after World War II, that caused the victory and then was the main force that defeated fascism and Nazism, they were afraid that its influence may spread in the region. They were clear that this could happen. So the British media especially began by propagating that Afghanistan as a result has become more equally important, the same important element in US strategy as the Iron Curtain governments of Europe are. It was clear that the US had already secured Turkey and Iran as a pro-West force country. But Afghanistan was a neutral state and had good dealings with the Soviet Union. And they wanted to secure that too, make sure that the encirclement of the Soviet Union is complete by taking over Afghanistan. So what happened was the propaganda was going on for several years. US media also did that. I don't want to go through that. But in 1953, the first step was taken by Vice President Nixon in 1953, who traveled to Afghanistan and met with the government and the king and all that, and tried to strike a deal with the Afghan government that if the Afghan government agrees to provide US with military bases and facilities, the US would provide them with a long-term loan to build the country. Afghan government refused. Okay. Now, in 54, 1 year later, US struck two military pacts in the region, one with Turkey and one with Pakistan, and mobilized these two governments to pressure Afghanistan to agree to switching from neutrality and non-alignment to the two sides of the bloc, the two blocs, to the side of the West and the US. That again didn't work. Afghanistan maintained its neutrality. In 55, the US created the military political pact known as CENTA, Central Treaty Organization. Its members, US, UK, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and Iraq. This lasted until 1979 when the Iranian Revolution happened. But again, the CENTA was used to pressure Afghanistan to accept the US deal. And still, the Afghan government refused. From that point on, the Shah of Iran and its Secret Service, Savak, was given the responsibility of creating havoc within Afghanistan for the government and organizing opposition, which were mostly these fanatic religious forces, against the government. All went on until 1973, when Mohammad Dawood Khan, the cousin of the king, through a court coup, took over. And this really scared the United States and the West that this might be a pro-Soviet move. So, interestingly, in 1974, immediately, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, traveled to Afghanistan and had meetings with Dawood and others. And it was after that meeting that Dawood succumbed to the US pressure and switched sides. And that is the beginning of the turmoils in Afghanistan. Because between 1973 and 78, opposition grew, partly with the help of the Shah Savak, and partly because of dissatisfaction and economic hardships and everything else. So in 1978, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which was active since the 1960s, actually took power and started a progressive democratic government in Afghanistan that carried out a lot of reforms. Especially important was liberation of women, giving equal rights to women, sanctioning women's education, allowing them to participate in universities, becoming government officials. That was one. Contrary to what US claims that they were then liberated, they actually destroyed the government that liberated women in Afghanistan. And secondly, which was the cause of the strengthening of the opposition inside Afghanistan, was a broad land reform in favor of the peasants and poor people, country people. And that really angered the fanatic religious forces, the big landlords, and tribal chiefs who held a lot of territory in their areas. And that was the beginning of a mass mobilization against the Afghan government, right? Now, still, US did not get directly involved until the Iranian Revolution happened. And that was really the turning point, because the US realized that the Iranian government, the new Iranian government, by joining the Nine Aligned movement, by changing the balance of forces in the Middle East, by opposing Israel and Saudi Arabia and others, by going through nationalization of the banks, insurance companies, main industries, and everything else, was becoming a threat. It was switching sides, turning the embassy of Israel to Palestinians, siding with the African National Congress against the apartheid regime, and all that. So, and in fact, turning the British embassy to Irish Republican Army. So the whole thing was threatening to the United States, and this caused the US to get directly involved in Afghanistan to counter the effects of Iranian Revolution. Besides, in addition to that element, there was one key factor. During the Shah's regime in Iran, the US had a deal with Iran to station radar listening posts on the border of Soviet Union in northern Iran, on the top of the Iranian northern mountains, to oversee and verify the US compliance with SALT II Treaty. With the fall of the Shah, these listening posts were lost, and US lost its ability to monitor what the Soviet activities are. So they decided that maybe they can do the same thing in Afghanistan, take Afghanistan over and use the northern mountains on the border to reestablish these listening posts. That is when you see Brzezinski going to the border of Afghanistan, talking about liberating Afghanistan from these communists and everything else. And after the government of Afghanistan, and really arming and funding these fanatic reactionary opposition forces that were opposed to all reforms that the government was carrying out, to overthrow the Afghan government. And this really shifted the balance of forces. If the US was not backing the opposition, Afghan government could probably manage the situation. But with the US direct involvement in that, and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, the Afghan government was forced to ask for support from Soviet government. And after repeated requests, finally the Soviets agreed to come in to kind of protect the government, to support the government. People think the Soviets withdrew because they were defeated by Taliban. This is not true. It was Gorbachev who, after taking power, decided that the support of the Soviet Union, the expenditure for the support of national liberation movements around the world, was draining Soviet economy. So he stopped it, including the budget for the operations of Soviet Red Army in Afghanistan. So they were forced to withdraw. Gorbachev was the reason for withdrawal of Soviet troops, not Taliban. So what happens after that, which brings us to the present situation? if you look at the map behind me, you will see Afghanistan is divided to 7, 8, 9 different ethnic regions. All of these ethnicities constantly in battle with each other, competing with each other, and all that. But they were all united against so-called godless communists. So they all fought together. But after the collapse of the Afghan government, they started having their own, fighting over whose share is hard, what is the amount of each party's share in this whole thing. And that caused a lengthy battle between them within Afghanistan over who controls what. The objective of the United States was to create a stable government in Afghanistan where it could carry out its own plans. And this really was causing frustrating US plans for controlling Afghanistan. So ultimately, with the help of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, they organized Taliban themselves with the Pakistani Secret Service doing the training, Saudis doing the financing, and US providing the arms. They unleashed that Taliban on Afghanistan, and they rapidly took over. And people of Afghanistan being tired, sick and tired of this infighting, constant years of infighting, they kind of welcomed that Taliban because of the stability they brought. And US was hoping that this stability allows the US to carry out its own plan, including the economic ones, because immediately after Taliban took over, UNOCAL signed a pipeline agreement with the Taliban government, and they came to the United States and visited US government officials from Central Asia, Soviet republics, to the Indian Ocean to export oil and gas from Central Asia by US corporations, Western corporations, to the international market, right? And they were about to do it. And 9/11 came and disrupted the whole plan and that stability. And everything went to the chaos. It was then that the United States decided to directly get involved. So they decided to overthrow Taliban, get rid of supporters of bin Laden and everybody else, create a puppet government under the control of the United States, trained military, create a trained military to control the country, and all that, in order to continue with their plans. Until 2014, this was for several years, since 2001. For a decade and a half, they fought. And finally, in 2014, actually, they realized, the US military brass realized that military victory is not possible. And they openly said that. And since 2014 until the withdrawal, the US knew there was no possibility of military victory in that country. But they continued. Why? They spent $2.7 trillion on armaments, on war. And who took the money? Military industrial complex. They knew they couldn't win it. They couldn't win it militarily, but they could win it economically. And they kept doing it. And you know, out of the $2.7 trillion, $532 billion is paid in interest on the debt created by the war in Afghanistan. So you can see that not only the military industrial complex, but also the banking system, the finance capital, was also milking the whole situation. Of course, they wanted this to continue. But came a time that the weight of China in the international situation becoming too heavy for the United States to be distracted by wars like Afghanistan. So they decided it's time to switch the focus. Okay. So many people think the US was forced to leave. No, it wasn't like Vietnam, a march of Taliban into Kabul that forced the US to escape. No, they themselves had an agreement a year and a half ago to withdraw. And they had agreed also among the 15 or so bases in Afghanistan, U.S. bases, Taliban agreed that 5 or 6 of them will remain. Who knows? Maybe it's the listening posts that are remaining. Nobody knows where the other bases are, but they are there. U.S. has not left. They have changed the form of control. Okay, they're relying more on economic control probably of Taliban than the military control. And one reason, one fact that testifies to this as a conscious move, not a retreat, is the fact that billions of dollars worth of U.S. war equipment and weapons were left for Taliban to be able to stabilize the situation. From as per the beginning plan that they had. So the idea is to stabilize Pakistan. And if you remember, Taliban used the same weapons to crush one ethnic uprising in north by Hazaras after they took over the country. And it was U.S. weapons used to crush that. Something that they couldn't do during any time during their rule. That Hazara area and Shir Valley was always independent of the central government until Taliban used the U.S. weapons and equipment and military leftovers to take it over. So now they're in full control. I am sure that the U.S. will resume its economic ties and use it as a leash on Taliban to have them do their bid. Cause trouble for China, cause trouble for Iran, for northern republics. And at the same time, U.S., in a sense, it seems to me that it's going beyond that Afghanistan and actually reorienting its own focus on Asia, East Asia, China, kind of disentangling itself from direct involvement in the Middle East region. And one example, one proof of that is now the steps Israel is taking to penetrate the Iraqi Kurdistan and Azerbaijan. It has obtained bases in Azerbaijan, military bases, and drone bases also, and as also its secret service is operating inside Azerbaijan. And there was the news that few Israeli F-35 fighters are stationed in Azerbaijan. In Kurdistan, the Israelis are active. They have created certain, not military, but operational bases near the borders of Iran. And in fact, Iran bombed a couple of those bases a while ago and declared that it will not tolerate Israeli forces near the borders of Iran. But we should expect more and more of these kinds of tension developing on all sides of Iran, probably against Russia and against China, probably less against China because Pakistan is closely tied to both Taliban and China. So probably that part of it would come in a muffle, but the other side probably will go forward. So this is the story. This is the situation we're facing. And I wanted to put it in context so we know what we're dealing with. And then I thank you and I open for questions.
So thank you very much, Bahman. That's a rather striking overview. And there's a lot of detail, I'm sure, that will make this richer. Just to remind people that you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll put them together and pass them on to Bahman. I have a couple of questions. that that have to deal with some of the issues that are really issues around what's happening within Afghanistan right now, to give us a better idea of what the United States has done to Afghanistan and how it's been affected. And one of the questions has to do with the move of the rural population to urban areas, and also the fact that millions of Afghans have fled Afghanistan since the 1970s. And mostly the Afghan refugees, as far as I know, before 2001, fled to neighboring countries. But after 2001, a lot of Afghan refugees have fled to Europe, and we see now that many of them are coming to the United States. So let's talk about, can we talk about those refugees? That seems to be, there are two items in the news. One is this, the quick leaving of the U.S. military. It wasn't so quick. After 20 years, you can't say it's quick. But the leaving such a mess, in at least as a public relations issue, that, and the second is all these refugees and where they should go. And the United States is divided. There are people who want to take the refugees and people who don't like refugees, don't like foreigners. So could you say something about these two groups of refugees, if I'm correct in grouping them that way?
Two groups of refugees you're referring to?
I'm referring to the ones before 2001 and then the ones after 2001. And the refugees, as I understand it, before 2001, most of them fled to Iran and Pakistan and maybe some of the former Soviet republics. But after 2001 and more recently, they've been fleeing, probably there too, but also to Europe, mainly to Europe.
Well, first of all, a good bulk of the refugees have migrated to Iran. There is a huge Afghan refugee presence in Iran, and Iran has been welcoming them, actually. Of course, like any refugee, they're having their problems as a second-class citizen or in terms of finding jobs and things like that. But at least the Iranian government has welcomed all of them. They have not blocked them. So the flow is still continuously from the beginning to the present. As to the refugees, we should not forget that millions of Afghans are displaced within their own country. It's not that they are leaving, all of them, or they all can leave. The problem is desperate. The issue is desperate, the situation. We know that before the U.S. moved in and set up this puppet government, close to 60% of the population of Afghanistan were living under poverty. And by the time U.S. left, it was 90% living below poverty line. So the whole economy was destroyed. Out of that $2.7 trillion, only 2% was allocated to rebuilding Afghanistan while they were there. And even that 2% did not go to any project for building Afghanistan or building the economy. It went into the pockets of the puppets that U.S. had installed. They built castles for themselves. There are pictures of that. They took the money out into foreign banks. Corruption was unbelievable in Afghanistan, and people in Afghanistan know that. So the whole question of refugees is a real issue, and I don't know how we can deal with that. My concern is that, okay, since 2001 there have been refugees, right? The ones who could just go through territories and walk toward the borders of Western Europe and all that, yes. But we have 75,000 flown to the United States, right? Those are all people who turned against their own people and collaborated with foreign invaders. U.S. doesn't care about refugees when it comes to the southern border. They put them in plane and turn them back. They just bring in plane loads of them who collaborated with the United States invasion to the United States. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be helped or lives should not be saved, but we should understand the dual standards or double standard that is being used here for allowing people in. And Europeans, after the first wave of refugees into the world, Merkel allowed quite a number, like 60,000 of them in. They're trying to close their borders. So one way or another, these refugees are in limbo. And the governments that these foreign powers that caused the problem, it was NATO in Afghanistan. It wasn't just the United States. None of these NATO governments are really doing their responsibility of helping the victims of these operations. So it is a huge issue. Again, I think in a meeting we had with the various peace forces a couple of days ago, Medea Benjamin talked about the campaign they have to demand from IMF, International Monetary Fund, to unfreeze the assets of Afghanistan so the money could go in there to help the people that are really dying of hunger, lack of basic necessities and everything else. But it is really a question that I think the peace movement in the United States should address in a fundamental way, because we are not dealing with refugees only in Afghanistan. We're talking about Syrian refugees. We're dealing with all kinds of people who are targeted, right? Look at the southern border. It's more than just Afghan issue. It's a global issue caused by imperialism. And we have to address it from that point of view.
We have a question about a big explosion north of the airport when the U.S. troops were leaving, and the question has to do with the CIA demolishing its central headquarters and also a notorious prison in the North region. Can you say something about that?
That notorious region,
notorious prison.
The prison was where they kept many of the prisoners, but I don't think that was the one that was blown up near the border, near the airport, because about that explosion, I don't know what it has been, but Bagram Air Base that kept thousands and thousands of Afghan prisoners, huge torture rooms and all over the place, and it was the one of the largest bases in the whole region. It's still there. It's about 90 miles north of Kabul. It's not near the Kabul airport. So I don't know about that explosion, what it meant, what it was. I don't know.
So then a question about the pivot that Obama announced back in, I guess, 2014, pivot to Asia, the Asia Pacific. And it seems to me that that was a realization that the U.S. was tying itself up in the Middle East and Southwest Asia and Afghanistan, and it needed to move its forces to challenge China.
That's true.
And threaten China, basically.
That's true.
So China has at least so far, has a working relationship with the Taliban, and I understand that even while the U.S. puppet government was in charge, China was doing some contracts to extract minerals, as was India. So the question is, what sort of working relationship do you think we have a right to expect the U.S. will develop now, as Afghanistan is ruled by the Taliban as part of its anti-China encirclement? How do you see this playing out?
Well, it's still too early to really determine what direction the Taliban will go, because there are forces from all sides that are trying to contain it or pull it in their own direction. It is clear that Pakistan, as one of the main partners of Taliban, has a lot of say in this. And and Pakistan has close ties to China and also been close of relationship. So in that sense, probably with the help of Pakistan, Taliban will have some kind of a relationship with China. But again, how much, how far they will go, nobody knows. But from the beginning, it is clear that China, Russia, Iran, who were the main three forces that countries around Taliban, around Afghanistan, have taken a cautious approach, in the sense that they have not opposed the Taliban return. They're trying to see if they can modify their behavior in a more rational way, and that they would not cause trouble for any of them. And of course, the U.S., I'm not sure if the U.S. has left Afghanistan. The visible part of the U.S. operations has left. Invisible part, I don't know. And besides, after 20 years of control of the country, I'm sure they have a lot of connections inside Afghanistan that are at work. And Taliban themselves, the faction of Taliban that has taken control, is more or less pro-West. And they have made their deals, and they have made promises to the U.S., and the U.S. has made promises to them, it seems, through the deal that they made, although the content of it has never been publicized, which is also problematic. But we never know. We have to wait to see, because the whole question of control of the country, given 8, 9 competing tribal forces, whether they can manage to create a government that includes all of these factions, or whether Taliban tries to single-handedly control everything. And also what happens to ISIS in Afghanistan. These are all unknown elements that we need to really wait to see how things develop before we can make any prediction as where things will go.
Well, you haven't said anything. Haven't said much about Saudi Arabia and the Taliban and the madrasas, the Saudi Arabia-Pakistan connection. Could you sort of put that in the context of the U.S., Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and even Iran and Israel? Is there something you can say about that?
Well, you put the whole lump together. I don't know which one you're referring to, but Saudi Arabia has always been a supporter of Taliban from the beginning, and probably will play its own role in that. I mean, let us not forget that these Muslim forces in Afghanistan are all Sunnis, and most of them Wahhabis, the same as the Saudi version of Islam. So they have ideological ties. So I'm sure the influence of Saudi Arabia will remain there. And given the fact that the Saudis are themselves close allies of the United States probably says a lot about what their influence will be there. But if you put it next to Iran, Iran is, Iran has signed a general agreement, 25-year agreement with China. They're open. They were just admitted to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's a new phase. Iran is moving towards the east, with Russia, China, and they have been cooperating, Russia, China, Iran, Syria, within the so-called resistance front in the Middle East against U.S. attacks on Lebanon and Syria, U.S.-Israeli attacks on Syria, on Lebanon, and all that. So there's a whole new realignment of forces happening, both in the region and globally, it seems. And China and Russia are getting closer again. So they're acting as counterweight to the United States. So I think we are in the process of a formation of new alliances and the new division of forces around the world. And U.S. is really afraid of many countries that are targeted by the United States to get closer to China, its competitor on the global scene. And that is really scary for the U.S. So there are a lot of factors are kind of in flux. And we are waiting to see how things land.
On a lot of different fronts. There's a good question here that has to do with the 1970s, and let me just quote the question, because I think that it goes to the heart of what the United States feared taking place in Afghanistan. And this is, I wasn't clear who made the progressive reforms in the 1970s following the coup and the Kissinger visit. Could you please clarify who did this and how they were able to accomplish these changes?
Afghan People's Democratic Party, which was a left force with leanings towards the Soviet Union. They were socialist-oriented party. They took over in 1978. And from that point on, they started the whole developmental project, the land reform project, the educational project. They provided as much as they could, health services, free education, all the kinds of things, new constitution for the country, and they were really moving toward industrialization of the country with the help of Soviet Union. And a lot had happened. There's a book published actually by Novosti Press about the achievements of the Afghan government during the short period that they were in power. Democratic government of Afghanistan. I have the book here. Let me. It's called Afghanistan Revolution Continues, and it is published by Novosti Press, and actually distributed by Imported Publications in Chicago. So you may find it. It is a very fascinating book about the achievements of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan during the short period of time they were in charge, and how they transformed the whole society and how the U.S. intervention reversed the whole thing.
So the period of time that they were in charge went from what, 1978, 1979 until about 1994?
No. Yes. Not that long, I don't think.
Well, it was, as I understood after the Soviet Red Army left, they continued for a couple of years before
right.
the Taliban was capable of, with U.S. support, capable of overthrowing that government.
It wasn't Taliban first. It was the Mujahideen forces that were organized.
So these were. Can you say something of the difference? Explain the difference between the Mujahideen.
Mujahideen was the alliance of all these tribal forces that, with the help of United States, organized against Soviet Union godless communists. And that was the motto of the whole movement: get rid of these foreign communists who have taken over. Right? That was the ideology that the U.S. mobilizes everywhere, that they want to go against communists, especially using this backward, religious fanatic forces that can easily be manipulated in that regard. So those Mujahideen, with the help of United States, were joined together, organized to a point that they could take over the government after the withdrawal of Soviet Union, right? But immediately after their takeover, started an infighting over who controls. And they were really bombing each other, even inside Kabul. They were shelling and everything from one end of the Kabul to the other side of it. And these guys were fighting each other for several years. And they couldn't come to any agreement in terms of who controls the country. Or they didn't come to agreement in terms of sharing power. That is when United States decided that this cannot go on like that. They had plans for Afghanistan, right? So they trained the Taliban, who are Pashtun, one of the Pashtun areas in the south of Afghanistan, in the southern part, and it's Pashtun. They are 40% of the population. So many of their refugees to Pakistan after the takeover of the so-called communists or revolutionaries in Kabul, they were brought back. There were some Saudi fighters that came to the region, the same way they're doing it in Syria. All of the fanatic religious forces from all over, they brought to Pakistan in madrasas that are religious schools, right? And trained them, not only in religious terms, but military terms and everything else. And then unleashed them into Afghanistan, and they rapidly took over. And it was that government that immediately brought the stability. If you remember, they did a lot of executions, beheading people, shooting women, and all those things, killing school teachers, especially school teachers for girls, bombing schools and all that. And they took over. And it was them that the U.S. started to deal with originally. And they brought their leadership to Texas, actually, to meet with President Bush and all that, and Cheney. There are pictures of Cheney with them. And it was the 9/11 that really disrupted the whole plan. And Afghanistan became a place for terrorist organizations, even Chechen Muslim forces. And part of the ISIS right now in Afghanistan are Chechen forces, which were imported by the United States to that area. So that was the force. So it wasn't the Taliban originally. There were several years of infighting going on in Afghanistan before Taliban were trained and prepared and ready to go in and take over. But 9/11 disrupted that, and the question of stability through the hands of the Taliban was kind of doomed, and they decided they have to go in directly.
So in a way, the U.S., after 9/11, the Taliban was no longer adequate to the task of doing what the U.S. wanted.
Right.
Now it had to be, the U.S. had to move in. This next question is actually kind of a segue from what you were talking about in terms of supporting the U.S. supporting these mujahideen and then supporting the Taliban. Let me just read it. America's track record of supporting and or building militaries so as to assert control of target nations has not been entirely successful. Support of nationalist Chinese forces during the Chinese Civil War, support of the French against the Viet Minh, support of the South Vietnamese Army during the Second Indochina War, support of the Iraqi Army versus the Islamic State, support of the Afghan Army against the Taliban. Can you comment on Washington's support of such ersatz armies? And let me just add to that, its support and then its turning on them, because it seems like you get support and then you get crushing. The U.S. crushes. So can you say something about the as a strategy of the United States, I guess, is the question.
Well, this is clear that the United States cannot carry out the missions that it needs to do to control the world all by itself. It has to find some forces to help them. This is the nature of imperialism. I mean, it's not that just that they created those forces, but they created Pinochet and Shah of Iran also, and Saddam Hussein. So they have to go use also proxies. And as the power of the United States as an imperialist power wanes, it has to increasingly rely on proxies to carry out the work. But the problem is that the only people or groups or forces it can recruit are reactionaries to do that. And these reactionaries over time, after helping them grow and grow and grow against other forces, when they take over, they become a menace to the United States itself. And the U.S. has to stop supporting them, and not only that, to crush them, to continue on with its task. But the history of U.S. is also a history of backing, turning its back against its own allies, right? The capital does not have a permanent commitment or alliance or loyalty. Where the interest of capital goes, it moves. And of course, things don't remain constant. So as the situation changed, U.S. imperialism shifted policy, as it is doing right now, turning its back not only on people of Afghanistan, but only on its own public. I mean, leaving all those Afghan troops, right? By just labeling as unwilling to fight, they justify them becoming targets of Taliban's wrath, right? So, yeah, this is not unexpected.
I saw something that recently that there were Uyghur forces in Afghanistan that were part of part of, I guess, the Islamic State.
Yes.
Would you say? Do you know anything about that? Can you say anything about that?
Not in detail, but I know I'm aware of their presence there. As I said, they have a lot of foreign mercenaries inside Afghanistan right now, and that's one of the challenges that they have to deal with, because they all fought as they were allies together with Taliban against the puppet government, and now they want their own share now, and that's what makes the Afghan situation unpredictable right now. We have to wait and see how these internal relations go.
There's a question which I don't quite understand. It's a question about a threat that Iran made about crossing on the Iran-Afghan border, and I'm not sure what that threat was about. Is it about the Taliban crossing the border? Is there something about that? As you said, that the Iran seemed to be welcoming Afghani refugees, despite the difficulties they were going to have. But is there something about the threat of the Taliban?
Then it may not be from the Taliban, but it may be one of these factions related to ISIS, Khorasan, that are stationed very close to the Iranian border in the south. And they may have made moves that has threatened Iran. Iran has been warning about that demanding from Taliban to kind of clean up the borders with Iran and not allow such activities to continue. But it is not a structured state. Still a tribal country, and a lot of people don't take orders from other people. So Taliban commanders and leaders may promise something, but whether they can implement it at the local level is a different story. The same way as you see with regard to Afghan women, Taliban may have agreed to some degree of freedom for Afghan women, but the local commander in such and such village is a fanatic, anti-woman, right? Goes by the dictates of the teachings of Islam according he understands it. So that promise from the top in Kabul does not necessarily apply to far regions of the country. So there is a lot of chaos. There is a lot of chaos in that sense. It's not that we are dealing with a unified government with its own structures and governors and all that. Each one of them, in any certain area, could be a tribal chief that does not want to follow any orders, right? And
so that raises the question: how big is the Taliban in terms of numbers?
Nobody knows.
I saw one number that said, 75,000 Taliban involved in this basically mop-up of the puppet troops. It's not a big number of people, or even not people, but armed forces. It's not a big number of armed forces to try to control that. It's a big country.
It is a huge country. And that's a visible part of it, right? The force that was required to come into the field to do things. But they have a lot of, grassroots base. And, they called into action those who they needed, probably no more. But nobody knows, because these allegiances go beyond a kind of an official organization, right? And they can have followers that can go into action if time requires. and so probably they have seen 75,000 of them, and I'm not saying it is limited to that. It's not a standing army.
The fact is that Afghanistan, in this whole modern period, through the whole modern period, has largely been very tribal, very localized. The United States, through its installed government, tried to create a central government. That didn't work, and I think that the military planners and so forth recognized that that was failing. That they didn't have the power to create a central government that actually had control beyond Kabul.
Right, exactly. That's the
Taliban's going to have
Afghanistan.
And the Taliban, notwithstanding, the Taliban's going to have the same problem. It's not clear that they want to do that.
Exactly. You never know which one of these tribal chiefs is going to rebel and say, I'm my own man. Right? You never know, because historically they have been at each other's throat. And it is only against communists that they have come together. But beyond that, nobody knows what will happen. Besides, the country is a very rough country. It's a mountainous country all over. And it's hard to reach certain areas of the country. So even if you take control of Kabul and a few big cities, doesn't mean that you're controlling the city, right? Even Taliban today, their control is ideological, right? Not organizational. They just have the support from a religious point of view, right? They don't have a standing army that has bases here and there in every corner of the country, or border patrol, or anything like that, because you cannot practically do that in that kind of a terrain. It's a very rough country, rough geography. And it's not easy to control.
So in some ways, it makes sense. One of the things I heard or read was that the CIA left a lot of people in Afghanistan, and given this lack of control, it seems that it wouldn't necessarily be easy, but to the extent that the CIA has trained locals,
right,
it would be possible to create these groups that do their own thing, or do the thing that the U.S. wants them to do, or some other force wants them to do,
exactly,
throughout the country.
Exactly.
It is not. It's just not a cohesive. As you point out, the cohesion was an anti-cohesion. It was a cohesion against an ideology that they were unwilling to accept or tolerate. But there's little. I think you're absolutely correct that the future of Afghanistan is very troubling. And it's not predictable, except that at least in the short and medium term, it's going to be as disassembled as it has been. It's going to be not integrated as it has been, and that's not a problem, except to the extent that groups can be created that either attack neighbors or are used to infiltrate, or whatever other kinds of things they might be doing that cause problems for Afghanistan's neighbors, and it's got a lot of them.
And I'm not sure if all of the U.S. special forces are out.
No, I think that so I would throw them in along with the CIA. They're coming under the Pentagon, but I think that they're pretty much the same kind of thing. So to the extent that they can continue, they will, doing whatever they have in mind. I would guess right now that their focus will be one on Iran and the other will be China, on opposite ends of the country.
Exactly.
So I just want to raise something that I put in the flyer, and that has to do about the generals. You spoke to who benefited from this, and that was these military contractors, both the ones on the ground and the ones making the weaponry. I just want to say something about the generals. The Afghan papers that the Washington Post published revealed that while the U.S. military leaders, one after the other, claimed the U.S. was winning the war, gaining support, controlling more territory, all that stuff, and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the corporate media dutifully passed on the great news that we were winning. While that was going on, the Afghan papers point out that they were lying overtly. They were knowingly lying. They knew that they weren't winning. As soon as they pulled back, the opposition, Taliban or whoever it was, moved in. There was no gaining of territory. They controlled a couple of cities to some extent, and even then. So they knew they were lying, all these generals. And have they been disciplined? No. Have they been indicted? No. Did they get charged with the slaughter of their own troops or the Afghan troops or the civilians? No. And then I saw this: 8 generals who commanded U.S. forces in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2018, so it leaves out 7 years, have served on more than 20 corporate boards. And here are 3 examples. Stanley McChrystal is the runaway leader. He served on at least 10 boards, and from one of them, JetBlue Airways, he earned $1.3 million. He was a commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. By the way, he was forced to resign when he mocked U.S. government officials in a Rolling Stone article. He had to resign. But then he became a senior fellow at Yale University. Imagine that. We're coming from New Haven, so that's a bit of an annoyance, but I could say more about that, but I won't. Then there's Army General David Petraeus, the commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. He gave classified documents to his mistress, and he was forced to resign afterwards as a CIA director. He became a visiting professor at CCNY. He became a professor at University of Southern California. He was a partner in Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, New York investment firm. He became a senior fellow at Harvard's JFK School of Government, visiting professor at the University of Exeter, and he got an honorary professorship at the University of Birmingham in England. He did pretty well. The third example is General Michael Flynn. He was, by the way, involved in that amazing victory in invading Grenada back in the 1980s. He was the director of intelligence for Joint Special Operations in Afghanistan. He was convicted of lying to the FBI as National Security Advisor under Trump. He ran his own intelligence group paid by an airlines. He was working for Kaspersky Labs, Palo Alto Networks, a whole bunch of these private companies, and he made out very well. So most of these generals did really well, despite the evidence, which is that they basically did what the military-industrial complex does, which is to keep the war going, and they powdered their careers and made out in the end. This is the corruption. It isn't just stealing money. So many people died. so many families were slaughtered, so many buildings and cities destroyed, and these guys get rewarded. That seems to me this is one of the signal tragedies that we in this country do not deal with, the absurdity and just the repulsive actions of these people. So if there are I don't see any more questions. There are a number of comments, but I think you can see in the question and answer there's a link to an article about American forces destroying a CIA base in a controlled demolition. There's most of these questions you've answered. There was one comment at the beginning that since you won't do it, I'll plug your book, Heroic Struggle, which is an analysis of how the Soviet Union fell. I would say it got decommissioned. Is what happened. Anyway, but it is. I read the book. It's an excellent book. It takes a very different perspective from everything else I've seen. So I'm going to plug it.
You mean decommissioned by what? What do you mean by decommissioned?
American Forces Commission. The American forces. I'm sorry. What was the context of that? I went off.
I didn't understand what you were referring to by it was decommissioned.
Oh, the Soviet Union was decommissioned. It was no, it was undone internally. But it was undone internally with enormous external pressure. It wasn't like it was undone in some kind of an independent way. That isn't the topic of this particular webinar, so I'll leave that to people to read your book.
Oh, thank you.
And they can make up their own minds.
Thank you.
Anyway, so I think that we've done very well. You've covered a lot of topics. Bahman, thank you so much for making this presentation for the Peace Council, and I look forward to further presentations on more subjects than I can mention right now.
Thank you very much, Henry, and thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. And thanks the New Haven Peace Council for the invitation. Thank you
all the participants. Thank you all.